What if the story we have been told about the beginning of human civilization is not the whole story, but only a fragment, a late chapter in a much older book that has been lost to time and memory and the slow grinding forces of the earth itself? What if, beneath the cities we know, beneath the ruins we have catalogued and the monuments we have measured, there lies evidence of something far older, something that existed long before the first stone was laid at Göbekli Tepe, long before the first grain was cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, long before the first marks were scratched into clay tablets in ancient Sumer? What if human beings lived complex lives, built structures, created systems of knowledge, and understood the world around them in ways we have not yet imagined? Not 5,000 years ago, not 10,000 years ago, but perhaps 20,000, 50,000, or even longer ago than that. What if ice came and buried them, and then the ice melted, and the oceans rose, and the coastlines where they may have lived disappeared beneath hundreds of feet of water, taking with them every trace of houses, temples, marketplaces, roads, and the quiet, everyday rhythms of forgotten lives? What if earthquakes shattered their foundations, volcanic ash covered their farms, rivers changed course and drowned their settlements, forests grew over their terraces, and the patient erosion of millennia wore away the evidence until nothing recognizable remained? These are not questions with easy answers, and perhaps they are not questions with answers at all. But they are questions worth asking, questions worth sitting with quietly as the light fades and the mind begins to drift, and we allow ourselves to imagine, just for a moment, that the world is older and stranger and more mysterious than the histories we were taught in school. This is not a story about certainty, but about possibility, about the edges of what we know, and the vast darkness beyond those edges, where ancient footsteps may have fallen on shores that no longer exist, where voices may have spoken languages that left no descendants, where hands may have built things that time has unmade so thoroughly that we cannot even see the empty spaces where they once stood. This is a story about silence and what might be hidden inside it. Let us begin, not with speculation, but with what we know, or what we believe we know, about the official history of human civilization as it has been taught and retold and refined over generations of scholarship and excavation and careful measurement of time. The standard narrative, the one found in textbooks and museum displays and university lectures, tells us that human beings lived as hunter-gatherers for the vast majority of our existence as a species, perhaps 200,000 years or more, moving in small bands across the landscapes of Africa, Europe, and Asia, following game, gathering plants, making tools from stone and bone and wood, but building nothing permanent, creating no cities, leaving behind only scattered campsites and the occasional burial. Then, according to this timeline, something changed, and it changed relatively recently in the grand scale of human existence, beginning roughly 12,000 years ago in the period we now call the Neolithic Revolution, when people in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from modern-day Egypt through the Levant and into Mesopotamia, began to cultivate crops, to domesticate animals, to settle in one place rather than wandering, and in doing so, to create the foundations for what we recognize as civilization. Agriculture allowed for surplus. Surplus allowed for specialization. Specialization allowed for complexity, and complexity allowed for the rise of villages, then towns, then cities, and eventually the great urban centers of antiquity. Places like Uruk and Babylon and Memphis, where scribes recorded laws, and priests built temples, and craftsmen worked metals, and a new kind of human life became possible. The oldest known large-scale architectural site, Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, dates to approximately 11,600 years ago, and it astonished archaeologists when it was first properly excavated, because it suggested that monumental construction, the ability to organize large groups of people to carve and move massive stones and arrange them into ritual enclosures, existed before agriculture, before settled farming communities, before what we had assumed were the necessary preconditions for such ambition. But even Göbekli Tepe, remarkable as it is, fits within the general framework of the accepted timeline, a timeline that suggests human civilization as we define it, with its cities, and its writing, and its hierarchies, and its monuments, is a young phenomenon, no more than 10 or 12,000 years old, a brief flicker in the long, slow darkness of prehistory. Before that, we are told, there were only hunter-gatherers, small groups, temporary shelters, oral traditions that left no written records, no stone buildings, no evidence of complex social organization beyond the band or the tribe. This is the story we have been taught, and it is a story built on evidence, on the careful work of archaeologists who have spent lifetimes digging through layers of soil, measuring carbon dates, cataloging potsherds and flint tools, and the post holes of ancient huts. And it is not a story to be dismissed lightly or arrogantly. But it is also a story built on what has survived, on what we have been able to find, and that is a crucial distinction, because the past does not preserve itself evenly, does not hand down its evidence in neat chronological order, does not wait patiently for us to uncover it. The past is destroyed, again and again, by forces far more powerful than human memory. Consider for a moment the nature of the archaeological record itself, the way in which the past reaches us, or fails to reach us, across the vast distances of time. What we find, when we dig into the earth, is not a complete picture, but a partial one, a collection of fragments that have survived, not because they were important or representative, but because they were durable, because they were made of materials that resist decay, because they happened to be buried in conditions that slowed their disintegration, because they were lucky. Stone survives, under the right conditions, for hundreds of thousands of years, and so we find stone tools scattered across the continents, evidence of hands that shaped them, evidence of minds that understood symmetry and function and the properties of different kinds of rock. Bone can survive if it is buried quickly, if the soil chemistry is favorable, if it is not gnawed by scavengers or dissolved by acidic groundwater, and so we find the bones of ancient humans, and from those bones we can learn something about diet, disease, stature, the evidence of injury, and the evidence of care. Pottery survives because fired clay is remarkably persistent, and so we find potsherds in the ruins of ancient settlements. And from those sherds we can infer trade networks, cooking practices, artistic traditions, the slow evolution of style and technique. But wood does not survive, except in rare circumstances, in waterlogged bogs or dry desert sands or frozen tundra, and so the countless structures that may have been built from timber, the houses and fences and boats and bridges and carvings, have vanished almost entirely from the record, leaving us to imagine what may have existed in the places where we find only empty soil. Fiber does not survive, and so the textiles, the ropes, the baskets, the clothing that people wore and used and depended upon, have disappeared, leaving behind only the faintest impressions, the occasional fragment preserved by accident. Organic remains, the fruits and vegetables and grains that people ate, the leather and hide they worked, the resins and oils they used, decay and return to the earth within years or decades, and so we are left to infer their existence from indirect evidence. from the shapes of tools, from residues on pottery, from pollen grains preserved in sediment. And if we move further back in time, the record becomes even more fragmentary because the Earth itself has been reshaped again and again by processes that erase evidence, that bury it beneath miles of rock, that grind it into dust, that melt it and scatter it and make it unrecognizable. The Earth is not a museum, carefully preserving the past for our inspection, but a living, changing, violent system, where continents drift and mountains rise and fall, where glaciers advance and retreat, carving new valleys and obliterating old ones, where sea levels rise and fall by hundreds of feet, drowning coastlines and exposing new ones, where rivers change course and lakes appear and disappear, and entire landscapes are transformed beyond recognition. If human beings lived along coastlines 20,000 years ago, when the sea level was more than 300 feet lower than it is today, and if they built their homes and their gathering places and their workshops on those coastlines, as people have always done, because coasts are rich in resources, rich in fish and shellfish and birds and the meeting of land and sea, then those homes and gathering places are now deep underwater, buried beneath sediment, scattered by currents, invisible to us unless we know exactly where to look and have the technology to search the ocean floor, which we are only beginning to develop. If human beings lived in river valleys that were later scoured by glacial meltwater, if they built on floodplains that were inundated by catastrophic floods when ice dams burst and released the contents of glacial lakes in a matter of hours or days, then the evidence of their lives may have been swept away entirely, carried downstream, broken apart, mixed with sediments from a dozen different eras, rendered unreadable. If they lived in regions that were later covered by ice sheets miles thick, the weight of that ice would have crushed and scraped and obliterated anything on the surface, grinding it down to bedrock, leaving nothing behind but the scars of glaciation. And so we must ask ourselves, when we look at the archaeological record and see a blank space, a gap in the timeline, an absence of evidence for complex human activity before a certain date, whether that absence is real, or whether it is simply an absence of preserved evidence, an absence created not by the absence of people, but by the presence of time and geology and the forces that destroy. This is not to say that absence of evidence means nothing, that we should abandon the discipline of archaeology and simply imagine whatever past we prefer, but it is to say that absence of evidence should be held lightly, carefully, with an awareness that it may be telling us more about the limits of preservation than about the limits of human capability. It is to say that there are gaps in the record, and those gaps are large, and those gaps are silent, and we do not know what may have filled them. Let us turn our attention now to some of the specific archaeological findings that have caused researchers to pause, to reconsider, to wonder whether the timeline we have constructed is as complete as we once believed. These are not wild claims from the margins of scholarship, but observations made by credentialed scientists working in recognized institutions, observations that do not fit easily into the standard narrative, observations that suggest the possibility, however tentative, that something older may be waiting to be understood. Consider the site of Gunung Padang in West Java, Indonesia, a stepped pyramid-like structure that has been studied intermittently since the early 20th century and was long assumed to be a natural hill with some surface modifications made in recent millennia. But deeper excavations and more sophisticated dating methods, including radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the layers of the structure, have suggested that the site may have been constructed in stages, with the deepest layers dating to perhaps 20,000 years ago, though this claim remains highly controversial and is disputed by many archaeologists who argue that the dating may reflect natural geological processes rather than human construction. If the early dates are correct, if there is indeed evidence of intentional human modification of the site at such an ancient period, it would suggest that people were capable of large-scale construction long before the Neolithic Revolution, long before the domestication of plants and animals, long before the rise of agriculture. But if the early dates are incorrect, if they are the result of contamination or misinterpretation, then the site may be much younger, and the mystery dissolves, and we are left with a more conventional timeline. The debate continues, and there is no consensus, and so we note the possibility, and we wait for more evidence, and we do not rush to conclusions. Consider the underwater formations off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, discovered by divers in the mid-1980s, a series of what appear to be terraced platforms, straight edges, right angles, carved steps, structures that some researchers have argued are too regular, too geometric, to be entirely natural. Others have countered that the formations are the result of erosion along natural fracture lines in the sandstone bedrock, that the sea and the currents can create surprisingly straight edges and flat surfaces, that no clear evidence of tool marks or intentional carving has been found, and that similar natural formations exist elsewhere in the world. If the Yonaguni structures are artificial, if they are the remnants of human construction, they would have been built when the area was above sea level, which was last the case more than 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, and this would imply the existence of a sophisticated coastal culture that we have no other record of. But if they are natural, then they are simply a reminder that nature is capable of creating forms that look designed, and the mystery is no mystery at all. Again, there is debate, and there is no consensus, and we note the possibility, and we wait. Consider the findings at the site of Blombos Cave in South Africa, where archaeologists have uncovered evidence of symbolic behavior, of art, of personal adornment, of the use of ochre pigments in complex patterns dating to more than 70,000 years ago, far older than the oldest known examples from Europe, and suggesting that the cognitive capacity for abstract thought, for symbolism, for the creation of meaning through material culture, existed far earlier than was once believed. This is not evidence of monumental architecture, not evidence of cities, but it is evidence that the people living in southern Africa tens of thousands of years ago were capable of sophisticated thought, of creating culture in ways that we recognize as distinctly human, and it raises the question of what else they may have been capable of. What other expressions of that capacity may have existed but did not survive? Consider the stone tools found at various sites around the world that appear to be older than expected. Tools that show a level of refinement and planning that suggests careful thought and long practice. Tools that hint at traditions of knowledge passed down across generations, across millennia. Traditions that we cannot fully reconstruct because the people who practiced them left no writing, no monuments, only the tools themselves and the faint shadows they cast across the landscape of deep time. Consider the genetic evidence, the studies of ancient DNA that have revealed interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other human species. Neanderthals and Denisovans, interactions that suggest a more complex pattern of migration and contact and cultural exchange than we once imagined. A world where different kinds of humans coexisted, where knowledge may have been shared, where the boundaries between populations were more fluid than the clean lines drawn on maps and timelines. Consider the geological evidence for catastrophic events in the distant past, the end of the Younger Dryas period approximately 11,700 years ago, which marked a sudden warming after a brief return to glacial conditions, a warming that may have been accompanied by massive flooding as ice sheets collapsed, and glacial lakes drained, flooding that could have reshaped coastlines, destroyed low-lying settlements, and erased evidence of whatever human communities may have been living in the affected regions. None of these findings, taken individually, proves that advanced civilizations existed tens of thousands of years ago, but taken together, they suggest that the deep past was more complex, more dynamic, more full of human activity than the traditional timeline allows for. And they remind us that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and that there are large portions of the timeline where we simply do not know what may have happened, because the record is incomplete, because the evidence has not survived, because we have not yet looked in the right places or asked the right questions. Let us imagine then, not as an assertion of fact, but as an exercise in possibility, what such a world might have looked like. A world that existed not in the familiar territory of recorded history, but in the dim reaches of the Ice Age, in the periods of warming between glaciations, in the lost millennia before the last great melt. Imagine a coastline, not the coastline of today, but the coastline as it existed 15,000 years ago, when the sea was lower, when the continental shelves were dry land, when there were beaches and river mouths and estuaries in places that are now 100 meters below the surface of the ocean, places we can only map with sonar and submersibles, places we have barely begun to explore. On this coastline, imagine a community, a group of perhaps 200 people living in structures built from wood and thatch and woven reeds. Structures that would have left no trace in the archaeological record because wood and thatch and reeds decay, because the rising sea drowned the land where those structures stood, because the sediments of 15,000 years have covered whatever foundations may have existed. These people are not primitive in the sense of being unintelligent or incapable, but they are living in a world before metal, before writing, before the domestication of grains, and so their technology is different from ours, built around stone and bone and plant fibers, around the deep knowledge of their environment that comes from generations of observation and adaptation. They know the coastline intimately, know where the fish gather, know which shellfish are safe to eat and which are poisonous, know the tides and the currents and the migrations of birds, know which plants can be eaten and which can be used for medicine and which can be woven into baskets or cordage, know how to read the weather, how to find fresh water, how to navigate by the stars. They have language, of course, complex language, because language is one of the oldest human technologies, and with language they have stories, myths, ways of encoding knowledge and passing it from one generation to the next, ways of explaining the world and their place in it, ways of remembering the past and imagining the future. They have rituals, gatherings at certain times of the year, perhaps aligned with the solstices or the equinoxes or the movements of the moon, gatherings where they dance and sing and tell stories and reinforce the bonds of kinship and community. Gatherings that may have taken place at specific locations, places marked with stones or carvings or arrangements of posts, places that held meaning, that were sacred, that connected them to the landscape and to each other. They have art, not grand monuments, but small portable carvings, decorations on tools, patterns painted on their bodies with ochre, designs that carry meaning, that signify identity, that express something about who they are and how they see themselves. They have trade, or at least contact, with other groups living along the same coast or in the interior, Contact that allows for the exchange of materials, of obsidian or high-quality flint or shells or pigments or knowledge. Contact that creates networks stretching across hundreds of miles. Networks that are invisible to us now because they were conducted without writing, without coinage, without anything that would survive. And they have knowledge, practical knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. Knowledge about how to knap stone into sharp edges, how to construct shelters that will withstand storms, how to preserve food, how to treat injuries and illnesses with plants and minerals, how to raise children, how to navigate disputes, how to survive. This is not a civilization in the sense that we use the word when we speak of Egypt or Rome or China, with their cities and their empires and their written records. But it is a human society, complex and functional and enduring, a society that may have existed for hundreds or even thousands of years in stable continuity, passing down its knowledge and its traditions and its way of life from one generation to the next, until something changed. Perhaps the change came slowly, as the climate warmed and the glaciers began to retreat and the sea began to rise, inch by inch, year by year, forcing the people to move inland, to abandon their coastal settlements, to find new places to live, new resources to depend on. And in that movement, in that dislocation, the continuity was broken, the knowledge was fragmented, the old ways were forgotten, or adapted, or transformed into something else. Or perhaps the change came suddenly, catastrophically, in a great flood or a tsunami or an earthquake, a disaster that destroyed the settlements in a matter of hours or days, that killed many of the people and scattered the survivors, that left no time for the careful preservation of knowledge, that forced a radical break with the past, a new beginning in a new place with only fragments of the old understanding. Or perhaps the change came from within, from a decision to abandon the coast, to move into the interior, to adopt a new way of life, a new relationship with the landscape, a shift from fishing and gathering to hunting and tracking, or the early beginnings of plant cultivation, a shift that left the old coastal sites empty, abandoned, waiting to be drowned by the rising sea. We do not know, and we cannot know, because the evidence is gone, because the coastline where they lived is now underwater, because the structures they built were made of materials that did not survive, because there is no writing to tell us what happened, no monuments to mark where they lived, only silence, only the absence where something may once have been. But it is possible, in a quiet way, to imagine them, to imagine the rhythms of their days, the textures of their lives, the things they cared about and worried over and passed down to their children. And in that imagining, we are not claiming to know the truth, but we are acknowledging the possibility that the past is deeper and richer than the fragments we have found, that there were lives lived and lost in the great stretches of time before history began to be written down, lives that mattered, that were as real and full as our own, but that have left no trace that we can easily read. Let us move deeper into this imagined world, into the details of daily life as it might have been lived in such a place, in such a time, not because we can prove these details, but because the act of imagining them brings us closer to understanding what it might mean for history to be longer than we think, for human experience to extend further back into the darkness of time than the textbooks suggest. Imagine waking before dawn in one of the shelters, a structure perhaps 20 feet across, built with a framework of bent saplings lashed together with plant fibers, covered with layers of thatch and hides to keep out the wind and rain, with a small fire pit in the center, and sleeping platforms arranged around the edges, raised slightly off the ground to avoid the damp. The fire has burned down to embers during the night, and someone, perhaps one of the older children, adds a few sticks to coax it back to life. blowing gently on the coals until they glow and the new wood catches and the shelter begins to fill with warmth and the smell of smoke, which rises through the opening at the top of the structure and disperses into the cool morning air. Outside, the sky is beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue to pale gray, and the sounds of the coast are waking, the calls of seabirds, the distant crash of waves, the rustling of the wind through the grasses that grow along the dunes. People emerge from their shelters, stretching, talking quietly, moving toward the water to wash, to relieve themselves, to begin the tasks of the day. Some of them, the ones who will be fishing, gather their tools, their bone hooks and fiber lines, their spears with stone points, lashed to wooden shafts, their nets woven from plant fibers and weighted with small stones, and they walk down to the beach, where several canoes are pulled up above the high tide line. The canoes are made from large logs, hollowed out over months of patient work with stone adzes and fire, shaped to sit low and stable in the water, capable of carrying 4 or 5 people in their catch, and the people push them down into the surf and paddle out beyond the breakers to where the fish gather in the deeper water, to where the currents bring nutrients and the sea is alive with movement. They spend the morning there, casting their lines, throwing their nets, spearing fish that come close to the surface, working in silence or with quiet conversation, reading the water, reading the sky, knowing from experience where the fish are likely to be and when to move to a new spot. Back on shore, others are walking along the beach at low tide, moving among the exposed rocks and pools, gathering shellfish, mussels and clams and limpets, prying them loose with wooden or bone tools, placing them in baskets woven from reeds, knowing which ones are good to eat and which should be left alone, knowing how many to take and how many to leave so that the beds will regenerate, so that there will be shellfish next month and next year and for the children's children. Some of them are moving inland, away from the coast, into the scrubland and the open forest, looking for plants, for roots and tubers and berries and nuts, for the raw materials they need, bark for cordage, wood for tools, resin for adhesives, fibers for weaving, and they move through the landscape with the ease of people who know it intimately, who have walked these paths since childhood, who can identify a plant by the shape of its leaves or the smell of its sap, who know which season each thing is ready and where it is most likely to be found. Others remain in the settlement, working on tools, repairing shelters, tending the fire, preparing food, watching the younger children who are too small to go out with the adults, but who are learning, always learning, by watching and imitating and being gently corrected, learning how to weave, how to knap stone, how to identify plants, how to behave, how to be part of the community. There is an old man sitting in the shade of one of the shelters, working on a piece of flint, striking it carefully with a hammer stone, shaping it into a blade, and a group of children sits around him, watching, asking questions. And he answers them patiently, explaining what he's doing and why, explaining how to see the stone, how to read its grain, how to predict where it will break, passing down knowledge that he learned from his grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather, a chain of teaching and learning that stretches back through time, unbroken until it reaches origins that no one remembers. In the afternoon, when the fishers return with their catch and the gatherers come, back with their baskets full, there is a period of communal work, cleaning the fish, shucking the shellfish, preparing the plants. Some to be eaten fresh, some to be dried or smoked or otherwise preserved for later, and the work is done together, with conversation and laughter and the easy rhythm of people who have done these tasks 1,000 times before and will do them 1,000 times again. The food is shared, not equally in the sense of identical portions, but equitably, according to need, according to custom, with the elders and the young children and the pregnant women receiving special consideration, with the rest distributed so that no one goes hungry, and the meal is eaten around the fire as the sun sets, with the light fading and the stars beginning to appear, and the conversation turning to stories, to memories, to plans for the next day. And then the children are put to bed, the fire is banked, the adults sit for a while longer, talking or simply sitting in companionable silence, and eventually they too go to their sleeping places, and the settlement grows quiet, and the night deepens, and the cycle will begin again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, the slow repetition of tasks and seasons and generations, the quiet continuity of life lived close to the land and the sea, life that leaves almost no mark on the earth, but that is nevertheless rich and full and meaningful to the people living it. This is not a fantasy, not an impossible dream, but a reasonable extrapolation from what we know about human societies that have lived without agriculture, without metal, without writing, societies that exist even today in a few isolated places, societies that existed until recently in many parts of the world, societies that demonstrate again and again that human beings are capable of building complex, functional, sustainable ways of life with Paleolithic technology, and that those ways of life are not impoverished or brutish or simple, but are in fact finely tuned to their environments, rich in knowledge, rich in culture, rich in the things that make life worth living. And if such societies existed in the recent past, if they exist even now in the present, then there is no reason to think they could not have existed in the distant past, in the Ice Age, in the periods between glaciations, in the tens of thousands of years before the invention of agriculture, in the silence before history began to be written down. The only question is whether any trace of them could have survived, and that is a question about geology, about preservation, about where we have looked and where we have not yet thought to look. Let us consider now the mechanisms by which such a world might have disappeared, not in a single catastrophic event, though such events may have played a role, but through the slow, patient work of time and the restless movements of the earth itself. The end of the last ice age, which began approximately 19,000 years ago and concluded roughly 11,700 years ago, was a period of profound environmental change, a transition from a world locked in ice to a world recognizable as the one we inhabit today. And that transition was neither smooth nor gradual, but punctuated by sudden shifts, by periods of rapid warming and brief returns to cold, by the collapse of ice sheets and the release of vast quantities of meltwater, by changes in ocean currents and atmospheric circulation that affected climates across the entire planet. As the glaciers retreated, the sea level rose, not steadily, but in pulses, in episodes of rapid increase separated by periods of relative stability, and over the course of the transition, the sea rose by more than 300 feet, drowning vast areas of what had been dry land, coastlines and river valleys and low-lying plains, places where people had lived for thousands of years, places that were rich in resources, that had been home to communities and camps and seasonal gathering sites, places that are now deep underwater, covered by sediment, inaccessible to conventional archaeological methods. The most dramatic of these sea level rises may have occurred around 14,000 years ago, during a period known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, when the sea rose by as much as 50 feet in a period of perhaps 500 years, a rate of increase that would have been noticeable within a human lifetime, that would have forced coastal communities to move inland, to abandon their traditional territories, to adapt to new landscapes and new resources, or to perish. Imagine living on a coastline during such a time, watching the sea creep higher, year by year, decade by decade, swallowing beaches, drowning estuaries, flooding the low ground where gardens may have been planted or shellfish may have been gathered, a slow invasion that could not be fought, could not be stopped, that simply was a fact of the changing world. The people would have moved, of course, because people are adaptable, because survival demands it, and they would have carried what they could, their tools, their knowledge, their stories, and they would have left behind what they could not carry, their shelters, their hearths, their markers and monuments, if they had any, left them to the rising water, to the waves and the currents and the slow accumulation of sediment, left them to become part of the drowned landscape of the continental shelf, invisible, forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered if we ever develop the technology and the will to search for them systematically. But it was not only the sea that changed. The land itself was reshaped as the weight of the ice was lifted. The continents began to rebound, rising in some places, subsiding in others, tilting and flexing in response to the redistribution of mass. And this process, known as isostatic rebound, continued for thousands of years, altering drainage, patterns, creating new lakes and destroying old ones, changing the courses of rivers, transforming familiar landscapes into something strange and new. And there were floods, not just the gradual encroachment of the rising sea, but sudden catastrophic floods, when ice dams that had held back glacial lakes burst and released torrents of water. Floods that could carry away everything in their path, that could scour valleys down to bedrock, that could deposit sediments dozens of feet thick, burying whatever had been there before, rendering the landscape unreadable. The best-known example of such a flood is the draining of Lake Agassiz, a vast glacial lake that once covered much of central North America, and when the ice dam that held it in place finally broke, sometime around 13,000 years ago, it released a volume of water equivalent to all the Great Lakes combined. That water poured into the North Atlantic, possibly disrupting ocean currents, possibly triggering a brief return to cold conditions, certainly reshaping the landscape through which it flowed. And if there were people living in the valleys downstream, living along the shores of the lake itself, then they would have had little warning, little time to escape, and whatever evidence of their presence may have existed would have been swept away, churned into the sediment, lost. And beyond the ice and the floods, there were other forces at work. Erosion, the slow grinding of rivers cutting deeper into bedrock, the winds scouring exposed surfaces, the expansion and contraction of freezing and thawing, the growth of vegetation, the roots of trees breaking apart stone, the action of burrowing animals mixing the soil, the chemistry of groundwater dissolving minerals, altering the composition of sediments, all of these forces working together, patiently, across thousands of years, to erase the marks that people may have made, to blur the boundaries between natural and artificial, to make it difficult, sometimes impossible, to tell whether a particular stone was shaped by human hands or by the patient work of weathering. And so, even if people did live in complex societies during the Ice Age, even if they built structures and created art and developed knowledge systems and traded across long distances, the likelihood that clear, unambiguous evidence of those activities would survive into the present is low, because the Earth does not preserve evidence evenly, because the processes of destruction are more powerful than the processes of preservation, because time is long and human memory is short, and the things we build, unless they are built from stone and placed in locations that happen to be protected from the forces of erosion and burial and submersion, do not last. This is not an argument that such societies certainly existed, but it is an argument that the absence of evidence should not be taken as definitive proof that they did not exist, that there are plausible mechanisms by which evidence could have been destroyed, and that we should remain open to the possibility that the deep past contains more than the fragments we have so far been able to retrieve from the ground. Let us turn now to the question of what knowledge such societies might have possessed, not the kind of knowledge that we associate with modernity, with science and mathematics and engineering, but a different kind of knowledge, equally valid, equally powerful in its own context, the knowledge of people who lived in direct relationship with the natural world and who depended on their understanding of that world for survival. This is the knowledge of patterns, of cycles, of the connections between things, the knowledge that comes from observation, from paying attention, from noticing, from remembering, from passing down what was noticed and remembered so that the next generation can build on it, can refine it, can adapt it to changing circumstances. Consider astronomy not as a mathematical science, but as the practice of watching the sky, of noting the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars, of recognizing that these movements follow regular patterns, that they repeat, that they can be used to mark time, to predict seasons, to navigate. People without writing, without telescopes, without any of the tools of modern astronomy, have nevertheless been capable of astonishing feats of celestial observation, creating complex calendars, identifying constellations, understanding the cycles of the planets, and there is no reason to think that Ice Age people were any less capable of such observations, any less interested in the sky, any less skilled at reading its patterns. They may have built structures aligned to the solstices or the equinoxes, markers that helped them track the passage of the year, that told them when to expect changes in the weather, when to prepare for the migration of animals or the ripening of plants. Structures that would not necessarily be recognizable as astronomical observatories unless we knew what to look for, unless we understood their purpose. And if those structures were built from wood or earth or unmarked stones, they would have left little trace, would have been eroded or overgrown or scattered by subsequent activity, and we would not know they had ever existed. Consider ecology, the understanding of relationships between species, the knowledge of which plants grow where and why, which animals depend on which plants, which predators hunt which prey, the complex webs of interdependence that make up an ecosystem, knowledge that is essential for anyone living by hunting and gathering, anyone whose survival depends on being able to predict where food will be and when. This knowledge would have been encoded in stories, in metaphors, in practical instructions passed from parent to child, from elder to novice, encoded in language that we would not recognize as scientific, but that, nevertheless, contained accurate, empirically tested information about the world. Consider medicine, the knowledge of which plants can be used to treat which ailments, which substances are poisonous and which are healing. Knowledge that requires careful observation, careful experimentation, careful memory of what worked and what did not. Knowledge that could be quite sophisticated, quite effective, even without an understanding of biochemistry or pharmacology, or the germ theory of disease. We know from studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies that they possess extensive pharmacopoeias, that they know how to use dozens or even hundreds of different plants for medicinal purposes, and there is no reason to think that Ice Age people were any less knowledgeable, any less skilled at finding and preparing natural remedies. Consider navigation, the ability to travel long distances and return home, the ability to create mental maps of vast territories to recognize landmarks, to use the sun and the stars and the wind and the shape of the land to orient oneself. Skills that are still practiced by some indigenous peoples today. Skills that allow them to cross deserts or forests or oceans with remarkable accuracy, using no instruments, only observation and memory and a deep familiarity with the environment. Consider craft knowledge, the understanding of materials, of how to work stone and bone and wood and fiber, how to select the right material for the right purpose, how to shape it, how to treat it, how to combine different materials to create tools and shelters and clothing. Knowledge that is the product of generations of experimentation, of trial and error, of refinement. All of this is knowledge, real knowledge, knowledge that works, knowledge that allows people to thrive in environments that would be hostile to someone without that knowledge. And it is knowledge that does not require writing, does not require formal education, does not require institutions or hierarchies, but that is nevertheless complex, sophisticated, and worthy of respect. And if such knowledge existed in the recent past, if it exists even now among people who have chosen not to adopt agricultural or industrial ways of life, then it could have existed in the distant past, in the Ice Age, in the time before the Neolithic Revolution, and if it did exist, it might have been extensive, might have been deep, might have represented thousands of years of accumulated observation and understanding. And when those societies disappeared, when the ice melted and the seas rose and the people were forced to move or to adapt or to abandon their old ways, that knowledge may have been lost, or may have been transformed, or may have survived only in fragments, in isolated practices, in stories that were no longer fully understood, but that were nevertheless remembered. This is one way in which history could be longer than we think, not because there were cities and pyramids and writing systems in the Ice Age, but because there were people with knowledge, people with culture, people who understood their world deeply and who lived in it successfully for thousands of years, and whose existence has left almost no trace that we can easily read, but whose absence from the record is not proof that they were not there, only proof that the record is incomplete. Let us imagine now how such a world might have ended, not in a single apocalyptic event, though such events may have played a part, but in a slow unraveling, a gradual transformation, a loss of continuity that happened over generations, over centuries, so slowly that no one living through it would have understood it as an ending, but would simply have experienced it as the way things were, as change, as adaptation, as the necessary response to a changing world. Imagine a community living on a coastline, a community that has been in the same place for hundreds of years, for so long that the origin stories no longer remember a time when the people lived anywhere else. And the coast is not just where they live, but who they are, the source of their food, the center of their ritual life, the place where their ancestors are buried, the landscape that has shaped their language and their stories and their understanding of the world. And then the sea begins to rise, slowly at first, so slowly that it might not be noticed from year to year, but over decades, over the span of a lifetime. The beaches grow narrower, the estuaries deepen, the marshes flood, and the places where shellfish were once gathered are now permanently underwater. The people must walk further to find them, must adapt to new gathering grounds, must learn new rhythms. The elders remember when the shore was different, when certain rocks were above the water, when certain trees grew closer to the sea, and they tell the younger people about it. And the younger people listen, but do not fully understand, because to them, the coast has always been as it is now, and the elders' memories are just stories, interesting but not urgent, not immediately relevant to the business of survival. And the sea continues to rise, and the people continue to adapt, moving their shelters back from the water, abandoning the lowest ground, consolidating into fewer, larger settlements and the old settlement sites. The places where their grandparents lived are drowned, are lost, and with them are lost the markers, the memory places, the specific locations that held meaning, that connected the people to their past. And perhaps the change is not only the rising sea, perhaps the climate is changing too, becoming wetter or drier, warmer or cooler, and the plants they depend on are shifting their ranges, becoming less abundant or disappearing entirely, and the animals they hunt are moving to new territories following the shifting vegetation, and the people must decide whether to follow the animals, to abandon the coast, to become something they have never been, or to stay and find new ways to survive, new resources to exploit, new knowledge to acquire. And some of them leave, small groups splitting off, moving inland or along the coast to new territories, and with them they take some of the knowledge, some of the stories, but not all of it, because knowledge is distributed. It is held collectively. It exists in the conversations and the rituals and the shared experiences of the community. And when the community fragments, some of that knowledge is lost. Some of the connections are broken. Some of the stories are forgotten. And some of them stay, and they adapt and they survive. But they are fewer now, and the old ways are harder to maintain, and the new generation does not learn everything the old generation knew because there is not enough time, not enough repetition, not enough need, and some skills are lost, some rituals are simplified, some stories are condensed or combined or allowed to lapse into silence. And then, perhaps, there is a disaster, a storm, a flood, an earthquake, something that kills many people, that destroys shelters, that scatters the survivors, and the community, already weakened, already diminished, cannot recover, cannot rebuild, cannot maintain the critical mass of knowledge and cooperation that is necessary for survival, and the people disperse, join other groups, are absorbed into other traditions, and the specific identity, the specific way of life, the specific knowledge of that place and that time is lost, is diffused, becomes part of something else, something new, but is no longer itself. This is not a story about primitive people being defeated by nature, but a story about the fragility of cultural continuity, about how much of what we know and who we are depends on stability, on being able to pass knowledge from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain, and how easily that chain can be broken by environmental change, by demographic collapse, by the simple fact that some knowledge is held by specific individuals, and when those individuals die without having fully taught the next generation, the knowledge dies with them. And if this happened once, it could have happened many times, in many places, across the long, slow centuries of the Ice Age and the turbulent millennia of its ending. And each time it happened, a thread was cut, a piece of the past was lost, and the world became a little bit simpler, a little bit younger, a little bit more disconnected from what had come before. And eventually, thousands of years later, we arrive at the beginning of recorded history, at the moment when writing is invented and the past begins to be documented and preserved in a way that is less vulnerable to the erosion of memory. And we look back from that moment and we see only fragments, only the scattered pieces of what may have been a much larger, much more complex tapestry, and we draw our timelines based on those fragments, and we say, this is when history began, this is when civilization started, not realizing that we are looking at the survivors, the inheritors, the people who came after, and that the true beginning may be much further back, in the silence, in the gaps, in the places we have not yet learned to see. What does it mean, then, to sit with the possibility that history is longer than we were taught? That the past is deeper than the textbooks suggest, that there may have been human lives, human societies, human knowledge, human meaning in times and places that have left no clear record, no monuments, no writing, nothing but absence and the faint whisper of possibility. It does not mean that we abandon the discipline of archaeology. that we discard the careful methods by which scholars have reconstructed the past, that we embrace every fringe theory and every speculative claim without evidence or critical thought. It means, rather, that we hold our conclusions lightly, that we recognize the limits of what we can know, that we acknowledge that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, that we remain open to the possibility that new discoveries, new methods, new ways of looking at the data may reveal things we did not expect, may complicate the story we have been telling, may push the timeline back further than we once thought possible. It means that we approach the past with humility, with curiosity, with a willingness to be surprised, with an awareness that the earth is old and time is long, and the forces that destroy evidence are powerful, and that much of what happened in the deep past is simply unknowable. Not because it did not happen, but because the record has not survived. It means that we resist the temptation to flatten the past, to make it simpler than it was, to draw clean lines and clear progressions, to tell a story of inevitable advancement from primitiveness to civilization, and that we allow for the possibility that the past was messy, complicated, full of experiments and failures and forgotten successes, full of people who are just as intelligent and capable and creative as we are, but who lived in different circumstances, with different technologies, with different relationships to the world. It means that we honor the possibility that there were lives lived in the silence, lives that mattered, that were rich and full and meaningful, even though we cannot name the people who lived them, cannot read their words, cannot visit their homes, cannot know their stories. And it means, perhaps most importantly, that we recognize that our own moment in time, our own civilization, our own accumulation of knowledge and technology and cultural achievement is not the inevitable culmination of history, not the pinnacle toward which everything has been building, but is simply one possibility among many, one way of being human among countless others, and that it is as vulnerable to loss, to forgetting, to the patient work of time and geology and catastrophe, as any civilization that came before. If we could travel back 15,000 years, to the coastlines that are now underwater, to the valleys that are now buried, to the places where people may have lived and worked and raised children and told stories and watched the stars, we would not find primitive savages huddling in caves, but people, human beings like ourselves, with the same capacity for thought and feeling and meaning, making, living lives that made sense to them, lives that worked, lives that were connected to the land and the sea and the sky in ways that we have largely forgotten. And if we could ask them what they knew, what they had learned, what wisdom they had accumulated over the generations, we might be surprised, might find that they understood things about the world that we have had to rediscover, or that we have not yet rediscovered, might find that their knowledge, though different from ours, though not written in books or stored in databases, was nevertheless profound, was nevertheless true in its own terms. But we cannot travel back, and they cannot speak to us. And the only thing we can do is imagine them, carefully, responsibly, without claiming certainty, without pretending to know more than the evidence allows, but also without dismissing the possibility that they existed, that they mattered, that they are part of the long, deep story of humanity, a story that began much earlier than the moment when writing was invented, much earlier than the moment when cities were built, much earlier, perhaps, than we have yet dared to imagine. And so we sit with the question, with the possibility, with the silence that may or may not contain voices we have not yet learned to hear, and we do not demand an answer, but we allow ourselves to wonder, to consider, to imagine, and in that act of imagining, we are not inventing the past, but we are opening ourselves to the possibility that it is larger and stranger and older than the stories we have been told. and that there is still much to learn, much to discover, much to be humble about. The earth is old, and human beings have walked upon it for a very long time, and the ice came and went, and the seas rose and fell, and the continents shifted, and the climates changed, and through it all, people lived and adapted and survived. And sometimes they flourished, and sometimes they declined, and sometimes they disappeared entirely, leaving behind only fragments, or less than fragments, leaving behind only the faint possibility that they were once here. And we who live now, in this moment, with our satellites and our databases and our carbon dating and our sonar mapping of the ocean floor, we are only beginning to develop the tools that might allow us to see further back, to look beneath the water, beneath the sediments, beneath the layers of time, to search for what may be there, or to confirm that nothing is there, that the silence is simply silence, and not the echo of lost voices. But the search has only just begun, and the questions are still open, and the past is still waiting, patient and silent, in the drowned valleys and the buried coastlines and the places we have not yet thought to look. And perhaps one day we will find something, some clear evidence, some undeniable proof that will change the story we tell about ourselves, about where we came from, about how long we have been trying to understand the world and our place in it. Or perhaps we will not. Perhaps the past will remain silent. Perhaps the evidence has been too thoroughly destroyed. Perhaps the ice and the water and the slow grinding of geological time have erased every trace, and we will never know for certain, and the question will remain a question, a possibility, a space for imagination, a reminder that there are limits to what we can know, and that those limits should inspire not frustration, but wonder. And in the meantime, as we wait for new discoveries, as we refine our methods, as we learn to ask better questions, we can at least acknowledge that the people who came before us, the people who lived in the long darkness before recorded history, were not primitive, were not simple, were not inferior, but were human, fully human, with all the complexity and creativity and capacity for meaning that the word implies, and that they deserve to be remembered, or at least imagined, with respect, with curiosity, with the recognition that they too were part of the story, even if their chapter has been lost. Perhaps history did begin much earlier than we were taught, and perhaps it did not, and perhaps we will never know for certain, and perhaps that is all right, because the value of the question is not in finding a definitive answer, but in keeping our minds open, in remaining curious, in refusing to accept that the story is finished, that the past is fully known, that there is nothing left to discover. The silence of the deep past is not empty, but full of possibility, full of the unspoken, full of the lives that were lived and lost and forgotten. And if we listen carefully, if we sit quietly with that silence, we may not hear voices, we may not receive answers, but we may at least feel the weight of time, the depth of the past, the humbling reminder that we are not the first, not the only, not the pinnacle, but simply the latest in a long, long line of human beings trying to make sense of the world, trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to leave something behind that will outlast the ice and the water and the slow, patient work of forgetting. And perhaps that is enough, to know that we are part of something larger, something older, something that stretches back into the darkness beyond the reach of writing, beyond the reach of monuments, into the silence where history may or may not have begun, but where humanity certainly existed, where people certainly lived, where the story, however, invisible to us now, was nevertheless being written in the lives and the days and the small acts of survival and meaning-making that constitute the real substance of the past. And so we let the question rest, not answered, but held gently in the space between certainty and ignorance, between knowledge and imagination, and we allow ourselves to drift as the light fades, as the voice grows quiet, into the deep, slow, peaceful darkness where all questions dissolve, and all that remains is the gentle awareness that we are here, now, and that we are connected, however invisibly, to everyone who came before, to all the forgotten people, all the lost worlds, all the silent pasts that preceded this moment, and that will remain silent, mysterious, and full of possibility long after we ourselves have become part of the silence.